Hello everyone. 41st session of Computer Application in Business or 5th semester BBA affiliated to Bangalore University. In this session, we are going to learn about transaction management and storage management. Before that, let us revise the content of the previous session. There we understood what is a database language, why it is required, and what are the different types of database languages. In that, we understood as to what is a data definition language, data manipulation language, data control language, and transaction control language. The learning objective of this session will be to enable the students to understand the transaction management and storage management. After the completion of this session, the students will be able to explain the concept of transaction management and storage management. Let's look into the content of this session. Here we discuss about transaction management. In that, let's understand first what is a transaction, what are the different states of transaction, what is commit transaction, what is rollback transaction, and what is storage management. Let us understand what is a transaction. A transaction is an event which occurs on the database. It reads or writes a value in the database. It is a logical unit of work that contains one or more SQL, that is structured query languages. There are different states of transaction. Let us look into different transaction states. First, let us begin with active stage. This is the initial state when the transaction has just started for the execution. So as soon as we give some queries, the transaction becomes active in the initial stage. So then it will move on to the state of partially committed. At this state, at any given point of time, if a transaction is executing properly, then it is going towards the common point, that's an end point. So here there are two possibilities like. So once we start with the initial stage, it has to move on to either to the end. This end can be either committing the transaction or it may end with incompletion. So there is a possibility of like failures, aborting a particular transaction. So that's how a transaction comes to an end on the negative side. On the positive side, when a logical unit starts working, it can move towards the completion of the transaction through execution. So from active stage to partially committed, if positively it is executed, then it will move on to the committed state and then it will end with the transaction. So partially committed is that state where the transaction is being executed properly and then it is moving towards the completion of a transaction on a positive side. Now let's go to the other state which is called as failed. Say, due to some reasons, if a transaction fails, so then the temporary values are not required, we will have to abort that and we have to take back, which is called as rolling back of a transaction. So if at any point of time, if the transaction is not executed properly, it moves to the state of failed. So after the state of failed, we may not need the temporary values. So we will have to abort. That is, we will have to cancel that and move towards the end of the transaction. So one more state is committed state, where from partial commitment, it is moving to the completion of a particular transaction. There are no failures and it is going to reach the common point, that's the end. And we have one more state called as terminated. Termination is putting an end to a transaction. Means to say, either through execution or through abortion. That is, we are aborting a particular transaction due to its failure. So these are some of the states which a transaction may go through, starting from the initial stage, which can be split into movement towards partially committed, that's the execution, or it can be a failure, so where we are rolling it back and aborting it. Suppose if it is moving towards the execution, then it reaches a common point, and at either of the situation, it is terminated, either committed or aborted. Now let's understand what is a transaction management. Again, what is a commit transaction? Let's see. A transaction management is a logical unit of processing in a database management system, which entails one or more database access operations. Now in that, we have something called as commit transaction and rollback of transaction. Now let's see what is a commit transaction. Committing a transaction means making the permanent the changes performed by SQL statements within the transaction. So whatever transaction which is being made by using SQL will be made permanent, where the user has explicitly or implicitly requested the changes in the transaction to be made permanent. So whenever a transaction happens, the user can request for the changes to be made in that particular transaction, and that changes has to be made permanent. So when it is done, we call it as a committing a transaction. As I told you, there can be an explicit request where user issues commit statement, that is to continue with the transaction, to end with a common point, or there can be an implicit request where there can be a normal termination after completion. So before a transaction that modifies data is committed, Oracle has generated two things, undo and redo log entries. So when the transaction is committed, SCN, which is system change number, is assigned and recorded in the table, and LGWR, which is a log writer process, writes redo log entries, and Oracle releases logs held on the rows and tables. Now, there is rollback of transaction, means undoing the changes. So we talked about committing a transaction where we are doing the changes as requested by the user, where here now we are talking about rollback of transaction. Now we are talking about undoing any changes to the data which have been performed by structured query language. So now when we talk about this rollback of transaction, there are different types of rollback. Statement level rollback, rollback to a safe point, rollback to the user request, rollback due to abnormal process, and rollback of incomplete transaction. So When we talk about these types of rollback, whenever we are undoing any changes, it can be at the save point or at the statement level or at the user request or due to abnormal process and rollback of an incomplete transaction. So this is regarding transaction management. Let's move on to storage management. Storage management encompasses of techniques and processes to maximize or improve the performance of data storage resources. It is the interface between low-level data stored in the database and the application programs and the queries submitted to the system. It basically handles the interaction with the file manager and efficient storing, retrieving and updating of data. So when we talk about store management, it acts as an interface between the data stored in the database and the query processing software. Let's move on to the multiple choice questions, which is based on the session. Just to sum up, we understood what is a transaction. Transaction is nothing but an event which occurs in the database where it reads or writes the value in the database. We understood different types of or states of transaction which may exist during the execution of a transaction, which are active, partially committed, failed, committed, aborted and terminated. Now we understood what is a transaction management. We also understood what is a commit transaction, doing the changes performed by the SQL. Undoing the changes is called as rollback of transaction. So under rollback of transaction, we understood what is statement level rollback, rollback to save point, rollback to user request, rollback due to abnormal process and rollback of incomplete transaction. So we also understood store management, which acts as an interface between the query, that is the user, in the form of application, a processing software, query processing software, and the database. Now let's try to answer the question. The first question here is, an event which occurs on the database is known as. We have different options: commit, rollback, transaction, and none of this. So an event which occurs in the database is known as, yes, transaction. Now, rollback of transaction indicates the dash transaction state. Now we are identifying which is the state which indicates a rollback. Is it failed, execution, aborted, or committed? Yes, answer is failed. When we are not able to execute a particular transaction, it results in failed state, and then later it is aborted, and then it comes to an end. Let's move on to the next question. The interface between the low-level data stored in the database and the application program is known as. Is it a store management, commit transaction, rollback transaction, or transaction management? The one which acts as an interface is nothing but storage management. The next question is, undoing any changes to the data that have been performed by SQL. We discussed whether it is doing or undoing. Let's see what are the options available. Is it a commit transaction? Is it a rollback transaction? Is it both A and B? or none of the above? We know that commit transaction is doing the changes and rollback transactions are undoing any changes. So answer is rollback transaction. The final question, which one of the following is not true when the transaction is committed? SEN is assigned and recorded. So we understood what is an SEN, system change number. LGWR, log writer process, that is log writer process writes. So that is LGWR. Oracle releases logs cost and none of the above. The answer is none of the above. These are some of the references made for this session. Thank you.